Good morning, everyone. We welcome you to our Saturday morning Bible study. Today is November 10th, 2018, on this nice, chilly November morning in Plainfield. We are recording from the Plainfield Christian Science Church Independent, Plainfield, New Jersey, the United States of America, and we are so happy to have you all with us today. And our moderator today is Luann from New York.
Good morning, everyone. Our reading is from Science and Health with Key to the Scriptures by Mary Baker Eddy, page 471. Question: are doctrines and creeds a benefit to man? Answer: the author subscribed to an Orthodox creed in early youth and tried to adhere to it until she caught the first gleam of that which interprets God as above mortal sense. This view rebuked human beliefs and gave the spiritual import, expressed through science, of all that proceeds from the divine mind. Since then, her highest creed has been divine science, which, reduced to human apprehension, she has named Christian Science. This science teaches man that God is the only life, and that this life is truth and love, that God is to be understood, adored, and demonstrated, that divine truth casts out suppositional error and heals the sick. The way which leads to Christian Science is straight and narrow. God has set his signet upon science, making it coordinate with all that is real and only with that which is harmonious and eternal. Sickness, sin, and death, being inharmonious, do not originate in God, nor belong to his government. His law, rightly understood, destroys them. Jesus furnished proof of these statements.
Thank you.
Yeah, that was very well thought out, considering our topic.
I like how she says that in early youth she tried to adhere to these Orthodox creeds. I was thinking that this morning that these doctrines and creeds were not necessarily God's law, but how it got interpreted down through the years and passed down the human understanding of God's law. But when she received the divine revelation, that the spiritual import was what she understood and adhered to.
A very clear explanation. Thank you, Luann. And this is why we must never feel discouraged if our children reject what they consider is religion, because reject it they should. This stuff is awful. What does it say? You're cursed and hung on a tree. that's pretty bad.
Wow.
Thank God Mrs. Eddy came with a revelation, with all the good, the beautiful, the pure, enduring,
And
hopeful, lifting us out of this terrible, it's a bondage. And yet when people think it's right and it's God, they will go to any extreme to obey it or to make someone else obey it. Whether it has any love, an ounce of love in it or not. When I first came into the Sunday school here, and it was here, I loved it from the very moment I entered, because I felt the warmth and the love of the Sunday school teachers and the congregation. My mother was Presbyterian, my father Lutheran, and I've told you I never wanted to go to those Sunday schools. And I'm not trying to be critical. I was only a child. I just didn't like it. I didn't want to go. But when I came here, I felt something very, very different. I didn't know what it was as a child. I just felt the love. And it wasn't until later I unwound my snarls and realized, even though I hadn't felt like I'd been browbeaten or anything, I had many misconceptions of God, including I was very afraid of him. I thought if you didn't obey him, something terrible would happen. Just a lot of fears about God. How can you love a God you're afraid of? Can't. So everyone...
That's not what fear of the Lord means.
No, that isn't. Respect, love, and obey him, but not be scared to death of him. So everyone who enters our church congregation, whether it be in person or online, should feel the love of God. That is what speaks. To realize we're not hanging by a tree, cursed.
Mrs. Eddy wrote that future generations will make strong demands on religion. She says to make strong demands on love. So we should all be making strong demands on religion. The religion, the true Christian religion that Jesus gave us.
Anyone else on this?
This is a wonderful distinction between having a bunch of rules you got to follow and where she describes that God's the only life. This life is truth and love. The rules that we follow are with truth and love. Simplifies the whole thing, but also is huge. It's really done.
Well, I think the point is it takes it out of the human, puts it squarely on the divine, which and the demand on us is to get out of the human mind. Don't rely on the human mind. Don't blame the human mind. Get out of the human mind and listen to what God is telling us. And then obey that.
Anytime you get under this sense of guilt and condemnation and all of that, that's the old theology trying to take hold. And it's a tormentor, and it will torment you day and night if you let it. If we've learned here, you've done something wrong, you repent of it, you turn to God, repent of it, make any amends you need to certainly to God, between you and God, and then anyone else who might be involved. You mean it, you change, and then you drop it and go on your way. Otherwise, you will be tormented for the rest of your life. Sarah likes to do that. You've got to shut it up. It's the only way to do it, is to shut it up. If you're nice to it and listen to it or think it has anything good to say, you're listening to the wrong voice and you're disobeying what commandment?
The first.
The first. That's why Mrs. Eddy said it was her favorite, and I loved what Amanda read on Wednesday in Miscellany. The first commandment of the Hebrew Decalogue, thou shalt have no other gods before me, and the golden rule are the all-in-all of Christian science. They are the spiritual idealism and realism, which, when realized, constitute a Christian scientist. Heal the sick, reform the sinner, and rob the grave of its victory. It's a powerful statement by Mrs. Eddy. And thank you, Amanda, for featuring it.
I think it ties in with the last part of this quotation. Sickness, sin, and death, being harmonious, do not originate in God nor belong to his government. His law, rightly understood, destroys them. Jesus furnished proofs of these statements. Thanks for that quote.
Yes. being inharmonious.
Yeah, Mrs. Eddy doesn't have any kind words for them at all, does she? She calls them inharmonious. She calls them illegitimate. They have no place.
One of the things. Go ahead. Sorry. No, go ahead. This says to me, because even Mrs. Eddy she found what God found her and she found God, that it's all hope. If I can find it after being raised in the Protestant church, and our children can too. This is my prayer for our children, that their hearts are open and they will find its peace in Christian Science.
Thank you, Shardy. That's so important. Because this is not like all the other religions and strict and stern doctrines when you really understand it. And scientists who get in this, kind of a condemnation attitude, not science, and guilt, not science. They've drifted back to their old theology, and in doing so, they give science a wrong name. Mrs. Eddy, and I wish I could find the quote. I haven't been able to, but I know I read it, where she said, "Love overrules always." If you're not sure whether, you've got to obey some rule you think you have to obey, or do what's loving, always do what's loving. And you always meet people from where they are coming from. People new to science, you would speak entirely different to someone who's been here for a long time. That's the difference between the lamb and the sheep. The one who's been here a long time, you would and need to speak differently, but never out of condemnation. Always from the standpoint of love. If we really live this science, each one of us here today, there's no reason why we can't usher in the millennium and change course of history for the better. 2 times this week I turned, one in Bignell Young and one in the Bible, where it's quoted that we have to pray in order to change what might come, to reduce the chemicalization that is to come if we don't. So, and it said it's up to the elect. See if I can find the quote, because I'm not quoting it well as I would like to. But Bignell Young speaks of it, and the Bible speaks of it.
It's Matthew 24:22, I think.
Yes, thank you. I do have it marked here. And except those days should be shortened, there should be no flesh saved, but for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. So what is that saying? Except those days should be shortened, there should be no flesh saved, but for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. And this comes up after a whole list of things that are going to happen, the desolation of the abomination of the desolation and things like that. So what does that mean?
So by doing the work, we don't have to go through the whole list of bad things. We can shorten it, do better.
And we could lead the world.
Right? That's right. If we do the work that we can do, it will change what's about to come, and it will shorten the time of the chemicalization, which means perhaps avoiding a war or some other big catastrophe. You need to understand this. This is why we take our watches so seriously. When it's not done, the place could blow up. Go ahead, Linda.
I was just going to say, when it says that Christian Science will keep crime in check, that's something we work with in our watches, I'm sure.
Absolutely.
Part of it.
Yeah, if we do our work faithfully, we could prevent having another 1,000 years of dark ages. And if we don't, what did Mrs. Eddy prophesy?
Another dark age worse than the first.
1,000 years.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's our job. To do the best we can with what we have right now and do it faithfully. If we do, the world will be better for it.
Not be made to forget or to neglect. What?
The duty to God,
And
mankind, and to our leader.
Yes. God, our leader, and to mankind. By our works we will what?
Be justified or condemned.
That's the only time I know she says condemned. So that in that way. So I take that very soberly.
It's also a wonderful thing that we have something to do with it.
It is wonderful.
It's not beyond our control.
Yeah,
That's great. That's all within our thinking. We've been given the tools to do it. So we rejoice over this. It's a great thing. It's a good thing.
I wanted to add something. I wasn't sure where I was going to put it in, but it's, to me, an important point about this law, because in Christian Science, the manual becomes the law which they hold over your head. And it was very distressing to me, to say the least, over the years, not knowing how to follow it. But in Precepts 4, Carpenter talks about Mrs. Eddy and the manual. I'm sorry, my dog's barking, so I'm sure this must be important. Mrs. Eddy said, in my hearing, this is Carpenter, my hearing, that the manual was not intended to obstruct the work of the cause, but to help and forward it. The essential important part of any bylaw is the spirit of it. It is an offense against God to use his bylaws without the spirit. Such a misuse belongs in the same category with the use of human laws that were passed wholly to restrain crime, to enable criminals to avoid punishment. The horde of lawyers that make a fat living interpreting law would not be necessary if people followed the spirit of the laws of our land. It is a literal interpretation of the letter of the law that enables many who deserve punishment to go unpunished. But he says a lot about the spirit of, and she even went around one of her bylaws to help a small town who needed a lawyer, and she was trying to explain you have to follow the spirit, and this is not the first time in several things he points out. And I think it's terribly important because it holds us it can be used to hold us incorrectly in a system of organization.
Thank you very much.
An example of the power of the Spirit is that what Mrs. Singletary described about non-Christian Science Sunday School had me in absolute fear and terror. And one of the things that caught me was when my friend finally discussed the belief of Christian Science with me, and what really hooked me was her description of spiritual nature of the story of David and Goliath. I was like, oh my gosh, I mean, it just totally changed my whole perception, and it was like, this is what I want my daughter to hear and learn.
That's beautiful. Thank you, Maya. You know, all of you have such good things to say. Since I mentioned a couple of weeks ago we needed to be a little more lively, testimonies and forums, boy, what's come forth is wonderful. You all have so much good to share. Don't let Era shut your mouth. Wonderful. Our testimony meetings, the forum, everything has been enlivened. So, thank you for that.
So, Luann, shall we get started? or rather, continue?
It's only 20 minutes.
Okay, so here we go. The topic today is law and grace. The readings were Ezekiel 20, Romans 5 and 6. And the first question is, what did Paul mean when he said, moreover, the law entered, that the offense might abound? But where sin abound, grace did much more abound.
Well, from reading in Matthew Henry's Bible commentary, I wrote down, when the law entered, sin was uncovered and seen. When conversion took place and corruption overcome, much sweeter were the comforts of grace.
Read that again.
When the law entered, the sin was uncovered and seen. When conversion took place and corruption overcome, much sweeter were the comforts of grace.
Thank you.
I read that the Hebrew law had 613 different commandments, and thinking about that, and also what Mary read about the first commandment, if you have 613 laws, it's going to be really easy to start getting offended and nitpick over things. But if you have just really one law that you have to look to, it's going to be a little bit more easy to figure out whether you're doing something right or wrong. So.
Thank you.
This thing gives me a picture of, creeds and doctrines and people trying to adhere to them, holding offices in churches, maybe going through the ceremonies and putting on the appearance of obedience to the creeds and doctrines. And yet, it's covering up a lot that really needs to be exposed and healed, but not allowed to because they feel like they're so right. One of the other problems that goes with it is that you judge others that don't go along with your creeds and dogmas, so to speak. And whereas if someone is just free, maybe they do have faults or whatever, if they're just free to follow their conscience and love God, it's going to be so much better. It's going to have more of the divine grace. And it's going to just be operating freely.
Well, the law is a code of conduct, but as it said in John 1:17, the law was given by Moses, but grace and truth came by Jesus Christ.
Yes. And it certainly is many ways to see next to this. What was it that made Mrs. Eddy ill as a child that her church was doing?
Predestination.
And what is predestination?
Well, only a certain number of people would be saved and others would not. Others are condemned.
There wasn't anything they could do about it. That was
Well, yeah, the idea that, your Catholic neighbor is going to go to hell because they're not whatever religion she was, or this idea, yes, predestination, you will go to hell. That made her ill.
I can understand that. I remember way back in the early 90s when there was that stuff in Waco, and that guy was teaching that only the people that were following him would be saved, and everybody else was whatever, and it was only 90 people or something. And I was just, what kind of a guy would create this whole big universe and then just say, yep, 90 people. Very disturbing.
Yeah, remember, we are not the judge. We're not God. Can't start saying, well, these people are doing it right and those people aren't doing it right. We can certainly follow what we know to be true in our hearts and lead the way. But all this judging. I love what Mrs. Eddy says about heaven and hell, because she wipes that whole thing out. Make your own heaven or hell according to how you're living right now. And you're not judged some distant state. You're being judged hourly. Makes sense. That this all makes sense. So, we carry with us our old theology beliefs. And we have to be very careful, because if we do that, we intertwine it with what we think science is. And that's bad enough. But then when you start teaching it or preaching it to others according to your viewpoint, then that's really bad, because people then don't understand what it really is now. And in many cases, that's what we find. So many scientists are just so turned off to what they thought Christian Science was. And their website's dedicated to that. And it just isn't the truth. Misinterpretation of what Mrs. Eddy says.
And I'm sure that is why Mrs. Eddy established the Bible and her textbook as the pastor of the church. Up until then, there were people preaching. And they brought with them their preconceived old theology beliefs.
Yeah, I like what Spurgeon says about this. In part, it reads that the law is the looking glass in which we see our spots, but it is not the basin in which we wash them away. The law has a provoking power, for such is the perversity of our nature, that no sooner do we hear the command, "You shall not do so and so," than at once we want to do it. And then he says that, yeah, it's quite interesting what he's anyway. And then the other part that is so good.
That's called reverse psychology.
Right. He says that sin may be a river, but grace is an ocean. Sin may be a mountain, but grace is like Noah's flood, which prevailed over the tops of the mountains, 15 cubits upward. So that was nice.
Yeah.
No, that's wonderful. And, we know many, you've heard about them, preachers, and certainly all these priests. They're preaching no sex and other things. And in the meantime, they're become obsessed with it. So be careful what you're preaching and what you're thinking about. And all any of us can do is the best each can do, and be an example. But there gets to be a lot of hypocrisy going on.
Well, John Gill, from Spurgeon's time, talks about grace as leading and teaching men to deny ungodliness and worldly lust. And what better way of following the law is that? And that's what I really find here at Plainfield, is this grace, this love, that it's very disciplined. And it helps you deny ungodliness and worldly lust. It's much more powerful and effective.
And what is worldly lust?
I would think it would be greed.
Material-mindedness.
And
it also includes the desire to dominate and control others by your own set of rules that you thought up in your own mind.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's worshiping the symbols, isn't it? It's lusting after more material, more human, more whatever the world seems to value, rather than seeking righteousness first, last, and always, letting God supply whatever is needed.
That would be why idolatry is not such a good thing.
Exactly.
Neither is idolatry.
Yeah.
Any form of idolatry.
And where all your motives are impure, your interactions with others are hate or things we've talked about, greed, but it's not love. it's not love. You know, two people can do the same thing in two different ways. One with a sense of love, compassion, and the other without. And that makes all the difference. You can have someone donate to the church, for instance, and do it widow's mite because they just love so, they want to see God's cause prosper. Or another one who does it because I want to show how great I am, and
or out of guilt.
Or out of guilt. Yes. Motive is what's so important, and that is why the Beatitudes are so important, because that all deals with your state of thought. And that's what fairly read, that law came by Moses, but grace and truth by Christ Jesus. So it's your motive, always. And that's where your spiritual sense comes in, to discern your own motives and also to discern the motives of others. Because what they can be doing might seem absolutely perfect according to law, but if their motive is wrong, then it's all wrong.
And then they can hide behind it, too, and be doing things that are dishonest.
Yes.
Hiding under law.
It is, and that's, who is that? Who are we talking about? The Pharisee thought.
Right.
And throughout this discussion, there are really two types of law, aren't there? I mean, one is this law that Jeremy talked about, all the laws. My goodness, how would you ever even remember all those laws? And frankly, this is part of the problem when our government gets so many laws. I heard someone say recently that almost all of us break government laws probably all the time because there's so many of them we don't even know what they are. So all of this law, and what is it trying to do? It's trying to curb you so you don't do anything wrong. Oh, look at that person, he's greedy, so I'm going to make a law so he won't do that. Look at that person, they're doing this, I'm going to make a law so they won't do that. And as we were taught here, and as Jeremy just mentioned, you only have the one law, and Christ has said this. What is the one law?
To love God and your neighbor as yourself.
And as yourself.
You.
If you
Yes.
obey that, you won't do any of the others.
Absolutely. All we have to do is obey that one law, and we wouldn't need the millions of other laws.
That's because obedience to that law fulfills all the law.
That's right.
Quote, unquote. So aren't we talking, this whole discussion about the law and grace, aren't we talking about the difference between humanly following a human directive or law versus spiritually obeying the spirit of God's law? Because, Mrs. Eddy wrote, Jesus knew that men could pray, several times a day and follow all the rules, and do the right things openly, and yet be sinful and greedy and lustful.
He saw them as hypocrites.
Yeah.
And very, very sad people.
Yes.
Yeah. But it's the spirit that quickens. It's the spirit of the law that matters.
And, there would appear to be these two laws. One is the human, material law, and the other is the law of God, divine law. And in Science and Health, Mrs. Eddy said, when infringing some supposed law, you say there is danger. This fear is the danger and induces the physical effects. We cannot, in reality, suffer from breaking anything except a moral or spiritual law. The so-called laws of mortal belief are destroyed by the understanding that soul is immortal and that mortal mind cannot legislate the times, periods, and types of diseases with which mortals die. God is the lawmaker, but he is not the author of barbarous codes. In infinite life and love, there is no sickness, sin, nor death. And the scriptures declare that we live, move, and have our being in the infinite God. This is why Mrs. Eddy teaches us to teach our children the spiritual and moral laws. Think about it. How much is that being done today? Or are you teaching them all these material laws about what to do and what not to do, and if you don't do this, this will happen, and etc.? And what are the spiritual and moral laws? Well, they're found in the Bible. They're found in the Beatitudes. They're found many places, certainly the Golden Rule.
Which should be fundamental in our schools.
Should be.
Among other places.
And also the Ten Commandments. Those are moral laws.
Well, they are the basis of all of our human laws in this country.
Yes.
Because when Jesus was giving the Sermon on the Mount and all his lessons, he was constantly going back and quoting from the Ten Commandments and the Old Testament. So it wasn't anything really different. It was just how it was being practiced.
That's true. Thank you. Mm-hmm. And that is something Tom has brought out many times. Everything that the Christ, that Jesus, and all that was in the New Testament is based on the Old Testament. That's why we don't throw that out like some people would like to, because they think it's just all fighting and wars. It's not. So much more, much deeper.
I have a friend who's Jewish, and she asked me, she'd never asked me about Christian Science before she knew that I belonged to the church. And she asked me, she said, is Christian Science just based on the New Testament? And I was so happy to tell her. I said, oh, no, it's based on the Old Testament and the New Testament.
Isn't that wonderful?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it was good I could tell her that.
It is very good, and we might not have known it if it hadn't been for the Bible study. Because my understanding, I've heard, I'm sure I was one, that, Christian scientists are very, very ignorant of the Bible.
That's exactly how I felt when we started getting into these Bible studies. I would walk away from each one saying, where have I been all my life? I hadn't learned this stuff.
Well, and that's why I think it was Tom who recommended initially a long time ago that we have Bible study.
It was.
But I just love the way Paul, Paul was such a powerful thinker and doer. And he saw things so clearly, and that, I'm sure, is why Mrs. Eddy has so much respect for Paul. Because he describes this so well. Moreover, the law entered that the offense might abound. But where sin abounded, grace did much more abound. He saw a glimpse here of the science. He saw that truth destroys error. Error cannot abound where truth is present.
And this is science. Isn't this wonderful? So maybe we should get to that part of it. Does anyone have any more questions on law and?
I just wanted.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to say about the fact that the word offense was in there. So many people are offended now, and I'm just grateful to have Mrs. Eddy's article taking offense to know that unless it's against God, there's not a reason to be offended.
That is so great. Thank you. Everybody's so offended about every little thing. Let's all be offended. Come on, grow up.
You mentioned we have the science now, and I looked up, and the word religion is used 41 times in Science and Health. The word science is used 955 times in Science and Health. And I think that's interesting, to be lifting us from old theology and false religion into a scientific sense of what we are. 955 times the word science, 41 times the word religion. Isn't that interesting?
That is wonderful. Thank you, Royce. Yes, because honestly, Christian Science is not a religion. So per se, it is a science. It is the laws and rules of the universe, and that is wonderful proof. Thank you for doing all that counting, or however you found it out. But thank you. That's wonderful. We'll have to make a note of that, Jeremy.
It is the science of life.
It is.
Yes.
It's wonderful. And Einstein, who was quite the scientist, he recognized it.
Yeah, he referred to it as the ultimate science. And that's why Mrs. Eddy says the one thing that's needed is Christ's Christianity.
Yes.
Not just Christianity, because she knew that that could be misinterpreted and screwed up and misrepresented. But Christ's Christianity is the science.
Thank you. That's such an important distinction, because there are many things that are going on amongst Christians that I feel uncomfortable with. A little more judging and things, and I'm not comfortable with that. Go back. What did the Christ say? What is Christ? What does he say? He tells you not to judge people. Read the Sermon on the Mount.
Matthew 7:1.
Judge not judged.
Yes. Too much of this going on, and it turns people off, and rightfully so.
Because it's not Christianity. It's not Christ's Christianity.
It's important not to think critical thought.
That's
the top of page 271 in Science and Health, Christ's Christianity is the chain of scientific being, reappearing in all ages, maintaining its obvious correspondence with the Scriptures, and uniting all periods in the design of God.
Thank you. Yeah. And that is it's our privilege, and it's our responsibility. That is what will change the course of history, what it might otherwise have been.
And if there's any war going on, it's always it's the human mind. That's it. Not color, race, gender, human mind. Human mind is what we're getting rid of here. But people we love, and it doesn't matter what they look like. We just love them. So
I want to just make a comment about the Old Testament, New Testament. So we had in a recent Bible study of 1 Peter. So Peter wrote there, "For all flesh is as grass, and all the glory of man as the flower of grass. The grass withereth, and the flower thereof falleth away. But the word of the Lord endureth forever." Now, the interesting thing about this, and this could be one reason why sometimes we don't see how much of the scriptures of the Old Testament are used in the New Testament, is that he doesn't write that this was from Isaiah. As far as we know, this is, unless we dig into it, we think that Peter wrote this. And that's littered all throughout the whole New Testament is verses from the Old Testament. But they don't always tell you who said it. It's as if, they all knew that was from Isaiah. And he's just quoting Isaiah. But if we don't know the Bible, we would not know that. And that's the reason we need these Bible studies, so we learn these things.
Exactly. Thank you, Tom.
That's true. I mean, they took it for granted everyone would know that, but we haven't studied the Bible, so we don't know that. I think all this is New Testament.
And when Matthew and Luke and Peter were doing their thing, there was no such thing as a New Testament. yet.
Mrs. Eddy did that too. She's got a lot of quotes in her writing that aren't attributed to where it came from. Just, little snippets here and there.
From the Bible. Yeah. Okay. So how are we doing, Luann?
Oh, very good. So what is the purpose of the law, and what does it require? I touched on a little bit of the purpose, but I think that it points out our relationship to sin, where we stand in righteousness, and it's a call to come out and be separate, to humble yourself and empty that vessel so that God can work through you.
Good. That's a good explanation. Is it the right law, God's law, not this other stuff, the human laws that are endless and don't mean much, if anything. But God's law, yeah. I mean, it's a check on where you are. You're staying on that straight and narrow path.
I think the purpose of law is to give us a roadmap, a purpose, direction. And God's law is already naturally within us. I mean, it's innate within us. And to the extent that human law mimics divine law, we follow it and we enforce it. To the extent that human so-called law does not mimic divine law, we rebel against it.
I think what you said, part of what you said, was just so powerful, because a lot of times we don't fully appreciate or understand something. And so if you have a law there, and you don't understand, but you follow it, well, that kind of keeps you on the narrow path, so to speak, without really knowing why or how or understanding it. And it's a process. You go through that process, and then you begin understanding it. So I think sometimes from a practical point of view, the trying to understand something before you obey something can be problematic, But if we don't fully understand something and there's a law and we're obedient, the understanding will come through during that process.
Yes, thank you.
That's very, very true. And throughout this whole process, your conscience will be your guide, won't it?
If you've kept your conscience polished, you're not a moral idiot. By disobeying it for so many times, yes, but yes.
One time a student said to Mrs. Eddy, "I'll obey when I understand." And Mrs. Eddy said, "Obey before you understand."
Thank you. I was just going to say that.
Oh, wow, that's marvelous.
Yep.
Well, thank you. I never knew that.
Well,
that's so crystal clear.
Yeah, and it's consistent with your point, Tom.
Yeah.
And Mrs. Evans used to drill that point often. And the point being, you understand as a result of your experience, and your experience is a result of whatever it is that you obey. So when you obey God's law, you begin to understand.
It's like working out a math problem. You might not have any idea how this thing's going to come out, but you just start obeying these principles and laws you've learned in your math class, and lo and behold, you get the answer to the problem. Now, if you started out and say, "Oh, I'll just do it how I feel," or whatever, not try to obey the rules and the laws, you'll make a big mishmash out of the whole thing. Laws are great.
But also, the obedience first includes a humility which opens the way for the understanding. I get this quite a bit. I don't understand. Well, are you obeying first? Just obey.
That's right.
Yes.
That's it.
I think that's just how everybody was raised, too, so it shouldn't be an usual idea. We're taught from an early age just to listen and do what I'm saying, so that you're safe and everything goes well. And then you go into school and it's the same sort of thing. So it's odd that people would come to this and be like, "No, I'm going to do what I want." So.
Yeah, that creates the chaos.
I think a good example is if every state in the U.S. had a different road rules. What a mess it would be if some states drove on the other side like England does. And makes me think of and that's exactly what happened, which God kept fighting with the children of Israel about, was that they would go off into their own little idolatries, and so everybody was conflicted with God and with everybody else because they didn't stick to the standard true law of God.
Wonderful example. Thank you. Very true. And of course, we know as scientists, we do follow the laws of the land for that very reason. Don't think we're above the law. We're not going to do it. Just as Lawrence says, take some humility. It's also why the intellect can be so damning, because if you're always questioning every little thing, well,
it causes confusion, and then you don't know what you're doing.
Thank you. Yep. And you're miserable. You can't think this, and you think that, and why this, and you just drive yourself crazy.
That's what Mrs. Eddy referred to when she said, when that takes place, you have lawyers earning fat paychecks interpreting the law, and what good does it do for society?
I think that's where Jeremy's hundreds of laws piled on the 10 Commandments actually comes into effect, because when it makes everybody so confused, then they question every law, even the 10 Commandments, because it is so confusing.
Yep. And that is what is happening in our government, isn't it?
You can kind of see why Moses kept giving laws, because when we read through those chapters or those books, they just kept disobeying at every turn. They saw these wonderful things, and they kept disobeying. So he's like, okay, here's another law. But I always have a question these days. Why do we still need full-time lawmakers? You go out driving, there's speed limits everywhere. Everybody basically knows what to do, and yet somehow there's still room for full-time lawmakers. I don't get that. Just to throw that up there.
Well, and as scientists, if we were all scientists, we wouldn't. You're right.
Practicing scientists.
Yeah, well, that's what I meant. Exactly. And that is our objective.
Spiritualization of the world in that respect. So until then, we seem to need laws, and fortunately sometimes more laws. But again, we do the work. We can change it.
This is another reason why this church is so special. Coming here, given something to do, and just sort of given that free rein to demonstrate is an amazing, different thing than the rest of what goes on. Very grateful for that.
Yeah. And Mrs. Eddy knew that it was different. She was a pioneer in discovering and establishing this science. And she knew that the human mind would oppose it in a lot of different ways. And that's why she worked so hard to give us a manual that would be a guidepost for us, that would be, if we could feel the spirit of the manual, obey the spirit of the manual, it would do everything for the churches. And it was only when the human mind tried to interpret it humanly that it screwed it up.
As it always will. Yeah, and it was considered or 88th manual was considered even by lawyers as brilliant. And also, in many ways, following our laws of the land, our Constitution, and all of these laws, they promote less government, more individual freedom,
but
more and more laws.
But it does, you can see where it does require a Christian civilization to be able to live that way. And I mean Christian civilization in the general, broadest sense, not in a religious sense. That you have to have people who respect the one God, who respect divine law, because the human law, the manual, and the Constitution are based upon the highest sense of divine law that was known at the time. And a truly Christian civilization won't need, as Jeremy says, won't need additional laws, to confuse things.
That's inside.
And that is why the most important thing we can do for civilization is to educate people about the Christian science, the science of Christianity,
which promotes the self-government that Mrs. Eddy talks about.
That's right.
And that's in law.
Man is properly self-governed. End quote.
And governed by God.
Right.
Yes, not end quote.
When governed by God.
But even Christian Science would be better off today if they followed the letter of the 89th manual instead of totally.
88.
You mean 88?
No, I meant the 89th. What I'm saying is if they followed the estoppel clauses, the way even it's written in my understanding in the 89th manual, then there wouldn't be a board because Mrs. Eddy couldn't sign off on the new board members. I mean, that's the way I read it. I mean, I had no idea about the 88th. I'm so grateful to learn about it here. But that was one of the places where I got completely confused because I started reading the 89th manual because that's all I knew about. And it was like, well, I questioned my teacher about it, and she said there's something about the estoppel clauses, and she was very good about loving Mrs. Eddy and her place and everything, and yet she even agreed that the estoppel clauses really didn't mean anything. And it's like, but so I quit reading it because it was too confusing.
You all probably know that there's a court case going on in New Hampshire now, and it's just been taken to the Supreme Court of New Hampshire, and a new brief came out on November 6th by Second Church Melbourne, Australia, the appellants, the plaintiffs. And this new brief, if anyone is interested in it, I got it from the court. I have it on email. I'd be very happy to send it to you if you want to bring your prayers to it and following it to see where it is and where it seems to be going. The Melbourne, Australia does not believe that we're going straight to the estoppel clauses, so the case is not really about the estoppels, but perhaps it can progress to that, and if anyone would like it, I would be really happy to send you this brief that has just been put to the Supreme Court of New Hampshire in this court case.
Thank you.
Interesting.
Is that what you just printed for me? Yeah. Jeremy has copies of it in our church.
Yes, I just sent it to you. So you have it. So no one would have to get it from me. They could get it from the church now, from your church. Thank you.
Okay, do we have time to go to Grace, or should we?
You want to cover some more, Luann?
Yes. Yeah, let's keep going. What is grace?
Well, in Webster's 1828 dictionary, some of the definitions are favorable influence of God, divine influence or the influence of the Spirit, in renewing the heart and restraining from sin, a state of reconciliation to God, faith, meekness, humility, patience, etc., proceeding from divine influence.
There's a lot of really good stuff in that definition. The spiritual instruction, improvement, and edification, and also apostleship or the qualifications of an apostle. Grace really covers a lot of ground. You can see why it's an ocean.
Well, my favorite definition, and I'm not sure where I got it from, but it's the spirit or influence of God operating in man to strengthen and regenerate. Regenerate means to implant holy affections in the heart, and it's a virtue of divine origin. So it's what's in you, the spirit or influence of God operating in you to strengthen you and to implant holy affections in the heart, a virtue of divine origin. Spirit is in you to operate in you, so you have the spiritual sense, your spirituality in you. It is of divine origin, and it lifts you up, way up past all this other garbage you really can't even explain. You're rising above the mist, and it is a grace given to all of us. We all have it. So even under the worst circumstances, that grace is there in you to lift you up above whatever it is that's pulling you down, the downward material tendencies that would try to pull you down into the quicksand, the mire of it. We all have it. You just have to listen. You know, that beautiful hymn, Amazing Grace.
One of my favorites. And when you let the grace of God rule in your heart, your conscience will always know what's right. You will always follow the divine law. You will heal the sick. You will raise the dead. You will cast out demons. You will be a great influence in this world.
One of my favorite verses in the Bible, 1 Corinthians 15:10. And this is the Apostle Paul speaking. By the grace of God, I am what I am, and his grace, which was bestowed upon me, was not in vain. But I labored more abundantly than they all, yet not I, but the grace of God, which was with me.
In pulpit, Mrs. Eddy refers to the grace of God, the effect of God understood. Before that, she talks about all the things that Christian scientists can heal. That was the grace of God. God understood.
All the healing that has ever taken place, all God, God's grace. No human person, God's grace. All that Paul did, all the apostles that they accomplished, certainly what the Christ has done, then grace. Divine influence operating. Divine origin. And how much we should cherish it, cultivate it, let it grow, bloom within us. It's up to us. Either we're doing that or we're
listening to the wrong voice.
Yeah.
Actually, it was in Christian Science versus Pantheism. I'm sorry. Page 10.
there's a song, look thou praying to heaven and hope for grace and for mercy. I like to also think of mercy as connected with grace. Maybe it's not quite as high, but I feel it together.
Mercy
It has
is,
to be his together.
yeah, they go together.
Thank you.
Mercy is the love of God that you feel in your heart for others, that comes to you with the grace of God.
Oh, well.
I just want to read some statements that I wrote down while I was studying through this, and just to summarize the whole thing, I guess. The law can do nothing to give you power over sin. It will show you where you are in relationship to sin and righteousness. It only happens through God's grace. It is only by God's grace that we are able to say no to sin and yes to God. Power of grace, ability of grace to change our lives. Because being immersed in Christ, we died to sin. We were in slavery to sin. We died to the power of sin to control our lives. Why do we still sin? Because we choose to. I think that last statement kind of answers Jeremy's questions. Why are there lawmakers? It's because people still choose to sin. Still choose to break those laws. There's some enticement there, a pride that they are above the law.
Right. But the answer is not to make more laws. The answer is to teach people
Correct.
the truth about themselves.
And there's a...
And to do good just for the love of God, not because, I'm obeying something or I'm going to be punished or anything, but just for the love of God, do right.
A major thing. Because if you're doing it because you're afraid of God, it won't last.
Yep.
It has to be because you're beginning to feel that love of God.
And that answers question number 4, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And grace also involves being able
We don't need more laws because we're not under any human law. We are under the one divine law. And that's where we should keep ourselves.
No, this was great, Luann. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Luann.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Luann.
Wonderful. Thank you.